He's trespassing. Arrest him now. I don't care if he claims this ranch is his." The shrill voice of Helen Ward, the HOA Tyrant of Willowbrook, cut through the flashing red and blue lights. I stood on my father's land after a 12-hour drive, my dog Rex at my side, only to be greeted not by peace but by police called on me by a woman who smirked as if she had already won. What she didn't know was that I wasn't just another homeowner. I was a soldier who had survived battlefields she couldn't imagine, a man who had buried comrades but never surrendered to bullies. And I wasn't about to surrender my father's ranch, not to her, not to anyone. If you've ever faced your own HOA nightmare, listen closely, because this woman just made the biggest mistake of her life. The Texas night hung heavy with a restless wind that carried the smell of mesquite and dust. Stars glittered faintly beyond a veil of thin clouds, and the gravel road leading into Willowbrook stretched like a pale scar across the dark countryside. Headlights sliced through the gloom as a battered Ford pickup crawled toward the old Hayes Ranch, its driver exhausted, his loyal companion awake and alert beside him. Ethan Cole's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary, knuckles pale against sun-worn skin. At 37, he looked older than his years, his body sculpted by a decade of service, yet his face etched with deep lines from sleepless nights and battlefield losses. His dark hair, flecked with strands of premature gray, curled slightly beneath a worn cap that still bore the faded insignia of his unit. His jawline was sharp, carrying the faint shadow of a beard he hadn't bothered to trim on the 12-hour drive from Fort Bragg, and his steel blue eyes reflected both weariness and an undercurrent of restless vigilance. Ethan had left the Army behind, but the Army had not entirely left him. Beside him lay Rex, a German shepherd whose sable and black coat gleamed faintly in the dashboard light. 8 years old, Rex carried the bearing of a soldier himself, once trained as a K-9 companion on overseas tours. His ears flicked forward at every noise, his amber eyes sharp and searching. A faint scar cut across the ridge of his nose, an old wound from a mission gone wrong, but the scar only gave him more gravity. Rex was loyal beyond question, bound to Ethan not only by training, but by the countless nights they had endured together. Cold mountain bivouacs, desert patrols, and the silence of grieving comrades. Ethan's chest tightened as the truck's headlights fell upon the weathered wooden fence built by his father decades ago. The boards sagged slightly, but still carried dignity, like a proud old veteran refusing to bow. His father, Samuel Cole, had been a stern yet generous man, the kind who spoke little but lived with quiet conviction. Samuel's sudden death from a supposed heart condition 6 months earlier had haunted Ethan during his final months in service. Now, driving down the gravel path, he felt the pull of memory, stronger than the exhaustion weighing his bones. But the peace he yearned for never came. The sharp wail of a police siren shattered the stillness. Red and blue lights spilled across the driveway, painting the farmhouse walls in chaotic flashes. Ethan's stomach dropped. He slowed the truck, raising a hand to calm Rex as the dog growled low in his throat. 2 police cruisers blocked the road ahead, their engines idling like watchful beasts. The first officer to step out was Officer Daniel Rodriguez, a man in his early 50s with a square build and a mustache that had long since faded to gray. His uniform clung tightly to broad shoulders that suggested years of field work rather than desk duty. Rodriguez's weathered face showed lines carved by experience and compromise, and though his expression was stern, there was no malice in his eyes. He had the look of a man who had seen both honor and corruption in small-town law enforcement and learned to survive by balancing the two. The second officer, Officer James Carter, was younger, perhaps 27, lanky with a boyish face not yet hardened by time. His short blonde hair peeked out beneath his cap, and his flashlight trembled slightly in his grasp, betraying nerves. He moved cautiously toward the truck, voice rehearsed and polite, though his eyes darted nervously between Ethan and Rex. "Sir, we received a report of suspicious activity and possible trespassing." Ethan rolled down the window slowly, keeping his hands visible, the instinct of a soldier who understood how quickly fear could turn to violence. "Officers, there's been a misunderstanding. This is my family's ranch. My name is Ethan Cole. I have the deed, if you'll let me reach for my phone." His voice was steady, though fatigue rasped in the edges. Before either officer could respond, another figure stormed into the glow of the patrol lights. Helen Ward arrived like a storm contained within a tailored suit. In her early 50s, Helen was tall and thin, with sharp features that seemed carved to convey disapproval. Her blonde hair, streaked with icy gray, was pulled back into a severe bun that accentuated her high cheekbones, and the permanent crease of disdain etched into her mouth. She wore a navy pantsuit pressed to perfection, the kind of attire that signaled authority, or at least the hunger for it. Around her neck gleamed a delicate string of pearls, out of place in the rural Texas dust, yet fitting for a woman who clung to appearances like armor. Helen's reputation preceded her. As president of the Willowbrook Ranch Homeowner Association for over 15 years, she had turned the position into her personal fiefdom. To her supporters, she was a guardian of community standards. To her detractors, she was a tyrant in heels, wielding bylaws like weapons and fines like bullets. Tonight, her pale eyes glowed with a predator's satisfaction. "Officers," Helen declared, her voice sharp enough to cut glass, "thank you for coming so quickly. As I explained on the phone, this man is trespassing on HOA-controlled property. We have strict regulations about access after dark, and I've never seen him before in my 15 years as president." She turned her gaze toward Ethan, her lips curling into the smile of a snake cornering prey. "I'm sure you understand we have to protect our community from strangers." Ethan felt heat rise in his chest, anger threatening to surge, but he kept his voice even. "I'm no stranger. My father owned this land. His name was Samuel Cole. He bought it after returning from the war in 1947. Ethan reached carefully for his phone, pulling up the scanned deed he had prepared for such moments. Military habit. Document everything. Rodriguez took the phone, his dark eyes scanning the documents carefully. After a moment, his expression shifted from suspicion to reluctant respect. "This all appears to be in order, Mr. Cole. My condolences on your father. You have every right to be here." He handed the phone back with a slight nod. Helen's smile froze, then hardened into something brittle. "Officers, I think you should know there have been discrepancies. Recent surveys suggest part of this land may fall under HOA common area. Perhaps Mr. Cole doesn't realize where he's standing." Her perfume, a heady mix of lilies and something acrid, seemed to cling to the night air. Rodriguez sighed, the weight of years pressing on his shoulders. "Ma'am, that's a civil matter. Without a court order, there's nothing we can do. Mr. Cole, welcome home." He tipped his hat and gestured to his partner. Carter, still uneasy, followed him back to the cruiser. The red and blue lights faded into the distance, leaving Ethan and Helen in the sudden quiet of crickets and wind. Rex stood bristling at his side, teeth bared, every muscle tense. Helen stepped closer, her heels clicking against gravel. Her voice dropped low, venom wrapped in civility. "You've made a mistake coming back here, Mr. Cole. This isn't your father's Willowbrook anymore. You'll find we take our rules very seriously." Her pale eyes locked onto his, promising a war. Then she turned sharply, striding into the dark like a general leaving the battlefield. Ethan stood motionless, heart pounding. He felt the weight of his father's legacy pressing against the uncertainty of the present. Rex nudged his hand, grounding him with quiet loyalty. Ethan exhaled slowly, staring at the ranch house silhouetted against the night sky. What should have been homecoming had become the opening volley of a war. And as Ethan gazed across the land his father had cherished, he whispered to himself, "I won't let them take it, not again." Morning came reluctantly to Willowbrook. A pale sun pushed through gray clouds, spilling thin light across the ranch. Ethan Cole stirred awake in his father's old bedroom, the mattress stiff, the air heavy with the scent of dust and aged timber. Rex had taken up his familiar post at the foot of the bed, head resting on his paws, though one ear twitched at every sound outside. Ethan sat up slowly, muscles stiff from both the drive and the tension of last night. His mind replayed the confrontation with Helen Ward, the smug tilt of her smile, the poison in her voice, the way she walked away like she'd already claimed victory. He felt the knot in his stomach tighten. When he opened the front door, the chill of the morning struck his face. The grass glittered with dew, but the scene before him pulled his eyes downward. On the porch lay a thick envelope, crisp and white, stamped with the HOA seal. Tucked inside was a neatly typed "Welcome Package." The words themselves dripped with condescension. As a new resident under the Willowbrook Ranch, HOA jurisdiction, please review the following violations and compliance requirements. Failure to act within 72 hours will result in escalating penalties. Ethan's jaw clenched as he scanned the list. The mailbox was allegedly non-compliant for being 1 inch too low. The barn roof showed unsightly wear. The lawn, despite the season, was cited for overgrowth. Even the rusted horseshoe nailed above the door for luck had been marked as aesthetic inconsistency. He almost laughed, but the weight of it pressed down harder than humor could relieve. Rex padded to his side, sniffing the paper as if he too could sense the trap. Ethan rubbed the dog's head absently, eyes lingering on the final page. In bold type, Helen Ward had added her personal note, "Mr. Cole, your father's exemptions no longer apply. This community expects compliance. You have 72 hours to consider selling. I have buyers prepared to offer above market value. Let's make this easier for everyone." The words burned. Ethan tore the letter in half and let the pieces scatter across the porch, the wind catching them like pale feathers. But before he could retreat inside, a voice carried across the gravel drive. "Mr. Cole!" Ethan turned. An elderly woman stood at the edge of the property, leaning on a cane carved from oak. She was small and wiry, with silver hair tied back in a loose braid, her dark eyes sharp, despite the softness of her wrinkled face, and her name was Linda Foster, a longtime neighbor he faintly remembered from childhood visits. Linda wore a faded floral dress beneath a wool cardigan, and though age had bent her spine, there was a fire in her posture that reminded Ethan of the older women he'd seen in war zones, survivors who had endured more than anyone suspected. Ethan walked to meet her, Rex trotting protectively by his side. "Good morning, ma'am." Linda's lips curled into a faint smile, but her voice carried the weight of warning. "You received their letter, didn't you?" He nodded grimly. "First thing I saw." Linda sighed, the sound heavy with decades of resignation. "You're not the first, Ethan, and unless you stand firm, you won't be the last. I've lived here 30 years. I've watched Helen Ward destroy good families. Pets vanish, gardens die overnight, windows smashed, cars keyed, and always there's never proof. People end up leaving, selling cheap, because they're too scared to stay." She lowered her voice to a whisper. "Last year, my neighbor lost his home over a bird feeder." A damn bird feeder. They fined him until he couldn't pay, then they took it. Ethan felt his throat tighten. He remembered battlefields where enemies were clear, uniforms marked. Here, the war was hidden, fought with papers and lies, but no less ruthless. Why hasn't anyone fought back? Linda's eyes glistened with unshed tears. Many tried. But Helen has friends in high places. Judge Randall Harrison, for one. He owns half the county, and she makes sure his pockets stay full. They've turned this community into their kingdom. She gripped her cane tighter, knuckles pale. Your father resisted once. That's why. She stopped, her voice breaking, then shook her head. Never mind. Just be careful, Ethan. They'll come for you harder than you expect. Rex pressed against Ethan's leg, sensing his unease. Ethan looked at the old farmhouse, its peeling paint and sagging porch, and he thought of his father's calloused hands building it board by board. He would not surrender it, not to Helen, not to anyone. The rest of the day unfolded like a deliberate siege. By noon, Ethan counted 3 different HOA notices pinned to his fence. One cited the barn for structural hazard, another warned of potential soil contamination, and the third threatened fines if Rex wasn't leashed at all times. Ethan tore them down one by one, but his chest ached with growing fury. It wasn't about regulations. It was about pressure, breaking him down piece by piece until surrender seemed easier. Late afternoon brought another visitor. A dark sedan pulled into the driveway, and a man in his 40s stepped out, dressed in a pressed shirt and tie despite the Texas heat. His name was Michael Weber, a real estate agent who often worked in tandem with the HOA. Tall and lean, with slicked-back black hair and a practiced smile, Weber radiated the confidence of a man used to closing deals others regretted later. His olive skin and sharp cheekbones gave him a polished look, but his narrow eyes betrayed calculation. "Mr. Cole," Weber said smoothly, extending a hand Ethan didn't take. "I represent several interested buyers. I hear you've inherited this property. Beautiful land, though maintaining it can be burdensome. My clients are prepared to offer you a very generous price, well, above market value. Cash. You could start fresh anywhere." Ethan crossed his arms, muscles tense beneath his flannel shirt. "Not interested." Weber chuckled lightly, but there was steel under the sound. "Think carefully. The HOA here takes standards very seriously. If you stay, it will not be easy. Regulations can become overwhelming." He adjusted his cufflinks, his smile never faltering. 72 hours. After that, the window may close. Without waiting for a reply, Weber slid back into his sedan and drove away, leaving behind the smell of polished leather and veiled threat. As dusk fell, Ethan sat on the porch steps, Rex's head resting on his knee. The weight of the day pressed heavy, but so did resolve. He stroked Rex's fur slowly, eyes scanning the horizon. He could almost feel his father's presence in the stillness, whispering courage through the wind. This wasn't a simple dispute. It wasn't about mailboxes or barns. It was a campaign of fear, perfected over decades. But Ethan had faced worse on battlefields oceans away. And unlike most who had stood against Helen Ward, he wasn't alone. He had Rex, his training, and a fire inside him that no regulation could extinguish. The war for Willowbrook had begun. The evening air was heavy with the scent of earth after a brief drizzle, a rare gift for late summer in Willowbrook. Ethan sat on the porch steps, a mug of coffee cooling in his hands, watching Rex patrol the edge of the property with quiet diligence. The ranch was quiet save for the occasional call of a night bird, but peace never lingered long in Willowbrook anymore. Ethan's mind replayed Linda Foster's warnings from that morning, the whispered tales of vanished pets, ruined gardens, families hounded out of their homes. It had sounded sinister, but part of him still wanted to believe the fight could be contained to paperwork and threats. That illusion shattered before dawn. Rex woke him first. The German shepherd barked with an edge Ethan recognized from combat zones, the kind of alarm that spoke not of nuisance but of intrusion. Ethan scrambled out of bed, pulling on his boots, his heart hammering with the reflexes of a soldier. He grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand and followed Rex through the screen door. The dog bolted toward the south garden, where the rose bushes bloomed in proud defiance of the seasons. The sight that met Ethan's eyes twisted his gut. The roses, planted by his mother decades earlier and tended faithfully by his father until his final days, were wilting as if struck by sudden plague. Leaves curled black along the edges, blossoms sagged heavy, and the air carried a faint chemical tang that did not belong in soil. Ethan crouched, fingers brushing the dirt, feeling its unnatural dampness. He lifted his hand to his nose. The smell was sharp, acrid, poison. The roses were more than flowers. They had been his mother's joy, carried over from her family's garden in Louisiana. His father had once told him, in one of his rare sentimental moods, that each bush represented a year of their marriage. Seeing them stricken felt like watching the graves of his parents being desecrated. His throat burned with fury, and his fists clenched until his knuckles ached. "Easy, boy," he whispered to Rex, though the words were more for himself. The crunch of footsteps drew his gaze to the edge of the property. A shadow slipped past the fence, moving quickly toward the road. Ethan raised the flashlight and caught a glimpse. A man of medium build in dark coveralls, a baseball cap pulled low. The figure paused only long enough to glance back before sprinting into the night. Rex lunged forward, but Ethan held him back with a sharp command. He wanted to chase, but instinct told him not to act blind. Proof mattered more than confrontation. Hours later, with dawn bleeding over the horizon, Ethan sat in the living room, eyes fixed on the laptop screen. He had installed security cameras around the property just 2 nights earlier after Helen's veiled threats. He replayed the footage again and again, jaw tightening with each frame. The camera near the garden caught the intruder clearly, a stocky man in his late 40s, face briefly illuminated by motion lights. He had a square jaw and a stubbled chin, his cheeks sunken as though life had worn him down. Ethan recognized him vaguely from years ago. Carl Jensen, a local handyman known for odd jobs. Carl had once been a decent man, quiet and hard-working, but rumors suggested he had fallen into debt after his wife left him. His weathered face, captured in grainy clarity, looked both angry and desperate as he poured liquid from a jug onto the soil. Ethan leaned back, his pulse loud in his ears. This wasn't random. Helen Ward had sent him. Carl might have been the hand, but Helen was the mind behind the act. The bitterness of coffee no longer dulled the fury rising inside him. Ethan's thoughts spiraled into memories of his father, Samuel Cole, kneeling in the same garden, dirt under his nails, humming an old hymn while pruning roses. To think those roses had survived storms and droughts only to be murdered by poisoners. It tore at something deep in Ethan's chest. He shut the laptop and pressed a hand against Rex's back. The dog leaned into him, steady and warm, as if reminding him that he was not alone. That afternoon, Ethan drove into town. Willowbrook was small, its main street lined with aging storefronts and a diner that smelled perpetually of frying oil. People watched him with a mix of curiosity and caution. He was Samuel Cole's son, returned from war, but also the man standing up to Helen Ward. Whispers followed him like shadows. At the diner, Ethan found Dorothy Kim, the widow who owned the place. Dorothy was in her 60s, a stout Korean-American woman with kind eyes that belied a sharp tongue. Her salt and pepper hair was tied back beneath a scarf, and flour dusted her apron. She had been a friend to Ethan's mother and often slipped him cookies when he was a boy. Today, Her expression darkened when Ethan mentioned the poisoned roses. "That woman has gone too far," Dorothy said, slamming a mug of coffee onto the counter. "Your father told me once Helen wanted that land bad. He suspected she'd try something, but he didn't live to see it. You'd better be careful, Ethan. She doesn't play fair." Ethan studied Dorothy's face, noting the lines of hardship etched around her eyes. She had endured her own battles, raising children alone after her husband's sudden death, keeping the diner alive when the economy dipped. She understood survival. "I won't let her win," Ethan said quietly, more to himself than to her. Dorothy leaned closer. "Then don't just react. Gather proof. People here are afraid, but if you show them what she's doing, they might finally find their courage." That night, Ethan returned to the ranch with resolve burning through his fatigue. He downloaded the footage of Carl Jensen, stored it on multiple drives, and wrote down every detail of the rose's destruction. He documented the smell, the texture of the soil, even the chemical stains on his gloves. He wasn't going to let this slip into rumor. Rex lay nearby, ears flicking at the sound of coyotes in the distance. Ethan scratched behind his ears, whispering, "We'll get them, boy. We'll get them for this." For the first time since he returned to Willowbrook, Ethan felt his military training settle over him like armor. This wasn't just about land anymore. It was about legacy, about his parents, about refusing to let tyranny root itself deeper into the soil they had cherished. By the time he closed his laptop, the roses outside were still dying, their petals curling inward like fists. But Ethan's resolve had never been sharper. The war had scarred him, but it had also prepared him. Helen Ward had declared battle, and she would learn he was not a man who surrendered. The night pressed heavy on Willowbrook, the kind of night where silence carried more menace than peace. Clouds smothered the moon, leaving the ranch in a dim shroud, the only light coming from the faint red glow of the security cameras Ethan had mounted along the fence line. He sat in the kitchen, the laptop screen casting a pale halo across his tired face. Rex sprawled nearby, with his head resting on his paws. The house creaked as though remembering old ghosts, and Ethan's thoughts swirled with the poisoned roses, with Carl Jensen's face caught in the lens, with Dorothy's warning at the diner. Scrolling through the camera footage had become routine, a soldier's habit of securing the perimeter even when the war seemed distant. But tonight, at nearly midnight, something new flickered onto the feed. Ethan leaned forward, pulse quickening. One of the roadside cameras picked up headlights, then the silhouettes of two figures near the old oak tree that marked the edge of his land. He increased the volume, and faint voices crackled through the speakers, distorted but clear enough. The first voice was unmistakable: Helen Ward. Her clipped cadence carried arrogance even in whispers. "He won't last." Men like Ethan Cole think they can stand against rules, but they break faster than they realize. The second voice was deeper, gravelly with age, carrying the slow drawl of someone who knew authority was a weapon. Judge Randall Harrison. Ethan had heard the name countless times in Linda's warnings. Now, hearing the man himself felt like a curtain pulled back. Randall was in his late 60s, broad-shouldered, though softened by time, with a frame that once suggested strength but now sagged under excess. His face, glimpsed briefly in the camera's infrared, bore a heavy jaw lined with a neat but graying beard. His eyes, though obscured in the footage, were said by townsfolk to be dark and cold, like wells that swallowed light. He wore a tailored coat despite the rural setting, polished shoes sinking slightly in the dirt, a man of the courthouse, pretending the earth beneath him still obeyed. What about his father? Harrison's voice was low, but every syllable carried weight. Samuel thought he could resist too. And where did that get him? A heart that gave out. He paused, a faint chuckle audible. With a little help. Ethan froze, blood draining from his face. The words struck like bullets. His father's death had always gnawed at him, sudden, unexplained beyond the blanket term of heart failure. Now the pieces rearranged into something darker. Helen's voice slithered back in. Exactly. The son will crumble the same way. We'll hit him with fines, violations, lawsuits, until the land bleeds money. He'll either sell or break, and if he doesn't, well, stress does wonders to the heart. Ethan gripped the edge of the table until his knuckles blanched. Rage surged, but beneath it was grief, raw and sharp. His father had not simply died. He had been hunted, suffocated by the same corruption now circling him. His jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached, but his eyes stayed fixed on the screen, forcing himself to absorb every word, every nuance. The conversation dragged on, Harrison warning Helen to be cautious, Helen boasting of her control over the board, her network of enforcers willing to do what polite society could not. Eventually, the headlights flared again as the two left in separate cars. The feed returned to darkness, but Ethan's mind burned with light, painful, relentless clarity. Rex shifted closer, sensing his turmoil, pressing his head against Ethan's knee. Ethan dropped a hand onto the dog's fur, grounding himself. "They killed him, boy," he whispered, voice breaking. "They killed my father." The weight of those words hollowed his chest, but behind the grief came a fire, hotter than before. If his father had been their victim, then Ethan would become their reckoning. Sleep was impossible. He rose, pacing the creaking floorboards, replaying memories of Samuel Cole. His father had been a man of principle, not quick to anger, but unwilling to bow. The night Ethan had told him he would enlist, Samuel had only nodded, his weathered hand gripping his son's shoulder with both pride and sorrow. Now that same hand seemed to rest on him again, guiding him, urging him to finish the fight Samuel had begun. The following morning, Ethan drove into town under a sun that seemed too bright for his mood. People glanced at him from the sidewalks, their gazes flicking away when he tried to meet them. Fear ruled Willowbrook, and Helen Ward was its queen. At the post office, a heavy-set man in his 40s named Robert Ward, Helen's husband, stood sorting envelopes. Robert was broad but slouched, with thinning brown hair and tired green eyes that seemed to carry the burden of long compromise. He wore a shirt that strained against his stomach, sweat darkening the collar. Robert had a reputation as Helen's silent partner, rarely speaking in public, always walking a step behind her. But today, when Ethan caught his eye, Robert looked away quickly, almost guiltily. Ethan noted the crack. Fear made people complicit, but guilt could make them allies when the tide turned. He said nothing, but the thought lodged deep. That night, back at the ranch, Ethan reviewed the footage again, documenting every word, every timestamp. He copied files onto multiple drives, storing them in places Helen's reach couldn't easily corrupt. He even sent one copy to Dorothy Kim, knowing her diner's backroom had hidden more than one town secret. For hours, he sat in silence, only the hum of the laptop and Rex's steady breathing filling the air. Grief kept pricking his heart, sharp and constant, but beneath it lay a new determination. He wasn't simply defending land anymore. He was avenging his father. As midnight crept over the ranch, Ethan stepped outside, staring at the poisoned roses. Their blackened petals glistened under the stars, a silent monument to everything stolen. He whispered into the night, voice steady despite the tremor in his chest. "I'll finish this, Dad. I swear I'll finish it." And as Rex sat faithfully at his side, the ranch no longer felt like a relic of the past. It felt like the battlefield of the present, and Ethan was ready to fight. The Willowbrook Community Hall was a squat brick building with peeling white trim, standing like a weary sentinel at the end of Main Street. Its interior smelled faintly of dust, old wood polish, and the bitter coffee served at every small-town gathering. On this night, every folding chair was filled, the low murmur of residents blending with the scrape of metal legs across linoleum. Ethan Cole stood just outside the double doors, one hand steadying the leash of Rex, the other gripping a flash drive that carried the weight of his father's memory. His chest felt tight, not with fear, but with the anticipation of stepping into battle without a rifle, armed only with truth. Inside, Helen Ward already held the floor. She stood at the podium with the poise of a performer, her navy pantsuit immaculate, pearls gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. Her hair was pinned tight, not a strand out of place, her painted smile calculated to inspire confidence. A large screen flickered behind her, displaying photographs of Ethan's ranch, crooked fences, unkempt patches of grass, close-ups of peeling paint magnified to grotesque proportions. "Ladies and gentlemen," Helen's voice rang out, sharp and commanding, "we are faced with a threat to our community." Mr. Ethan Cole has repeatedly refused compliance. He has neglected his property, endangered our standards, and harassed board members with intimidation. These images speak for themselves. Gasps rippled through the room as she clicked through slide after slide, some so poorly altered, Ethan nearly laughed. A broken window that didn't exist, garbage bags that had never sat on his porch, even what looked like a rusted car abandoned in the driveway. The photos had been doctored, but Helen delivered them with conviction. Near the front row, Judge Randall Harrison sat with his bulky frame draped in a tailored gray suit, his beard neatly trimmed. His cold eyes scanned the crowd with authority, like a shepherd ensuring his flock obeyed. To his left, Robert Ward shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his wide shoulders slouched, eyes cast downward as if he wanted to vanish. Ethan's pulse quickened, but his steps were steady as he pushed the doors open. The squeal of hinges turned heads. Conversation hushed. Rex padded beside him, muscles taut, amber eyes scanning the crowd. The sight of the soldier and his dog crossing the hall's threshold carried its own gravity, enough to silence whispers. Helen's smile faltered, then froze. "Mr. Cole," she said, her voice dipped in venom but coated with civility, "how kind of you to join us. Perhaps you'd like to explain your blatant disregard for the rules?" Ethan stopped at the center aisle, every eye upon him. He spoke clearly, his voice low but carrying across the room. "You accuse me of neglect. You accuse me of harassment, but what you're really guilty of is lies." A murmur swelled. Helen's hand tightened on the podium. "Baseless. Accusations. The community deserves facts." Ethan raised the flash drive. "Then let's show them facts." He walked to the projector, slipping the drive into the port. For a tense moment, nothing happened. Then the screen shifted. Grainy black and white footage appeared. Carl Jensen, pouring chemicals onto the rose beds, caught in the stark glare of security lights. Gasps echoed louder now, disbelief and recognition mixing in the crowd. Someone muttered Carl's name. Others exchanged uneasy glances. Ethan's voice cut through. "These roses were planted by my mother and cared for by my father. They were poisoned under Helen Ward's orders. That's not speculation. That's evidence." He paused, letting the image linger. "And there's more." The footage changed. Ethan had spliced in the recording from the roadside camera. The audio crackled, but the voices were unmistakable. Helen and Judge Harrison speaking of Samuel Cole's death, hinting at a heart that had not failed by chance. The hall went deathly silent. Harrison's jaw clenched, his hand tightening into a fist on his knee. But he said nothing. Helen's face drained of color, then flushed red. "This is fabricated," she snapped, her voice shrill now, no longer controlled. "He is using military tricks to deceive you, to intimidate you." "None of this is real." From the back of the room, Dorothy Kim rose. Her stout figure and flour-dusted apron contrasted sharply with the polished attire of the board members. Her voice, however, was clear and unwavering. "I've lived here 30 years. I've seen families destroyed by this HOA. And I know Ethan Cole's father. Samuel was a good man. If his son says this is true, I believe him. And you should too." The crowd stirred. Whispers turned into louder voices. "She went too far. That's Harrison's voice. This isn't right." People who had once bowed their heads now raised them, the weight of fear beginning to crack. Ethan turned slowly, sweeping the room with his gaze. "This isn't about lawns or fences. This is about control. Helen Ward and her allies have bled this community for years. But the truth is here now. You can see it, hear it. You don't have to be afraid anymore." Robert Ward finally lifted his head, his green eyes glassy with shame. His lips parted as though he wanted to speak, but Helen's glare pinned him silent. Even so, the guilt in his expression was visible to all. Helen slammed her fist on the podium. "This meeting is over. These accusations are slanderous, illegal." Her voice broke, the mask slipping entirely, revealing not control but desperation. "You people don't understand what's at stake. Without order, this town will collapse. I've kept you safe." But the spell had shattered. Neighbors stood, some shouting questions, others demanding accountability. A man in work boots and a flannel shirt shouted, "Safe? You poisoned his roses." Another woman cried, "What did you do to his father?" Helen's composure crumbled. She tried to raise her voice above the din, but the hall no longer belonged to her. The murmurs turned to roars, and for the first time in years, Helen Ward stood not as queen, but as cornered tyrant, exposed before the very people she had ruled. Ethan stood firm in the chaos, Rex at his side, his heart pounding not with fear, but with grim satisfaction. He had come armed with proof, and now the community itself had seen what lay beneath Helen's polished veneer. The battle was far from over, but tonight the tide had shifted. The night after the disastrous HOA meeting was heavy with anticipation. Willowbrook buzzed with gossip, rumors moving faster than wildfire across the small town. Some whispered that Ethan had fabricated everything, a soldier desperate for attention. Others, more quietly, admitted they had always suspected Helen Ward and Judge Randall Harrison of dealings that smelled of rot. Ethan stayed at the ranch, pacing the creaking floorboards of his father's house, unable to rest. Rex followed him like a shadow, the German shepherd's amber eyes watchful, sensing his master's turmoil. The knock came just after midnight. 3 firm raps, then silence. Ethan stiffened, hand instinctively reaching for the old hunting rifle mounted above the mantel. Rex growled low in his throat, but didn't move until Ethan gave the signal. Opening the door cautiously, Ethan found Robert Ward standing on the porch. Robert looked smaller than he had at the community hall, stripped of the shadow of his wife's presence. His broad shoulders slumped forward, his shirt untucked, his thinning hair damp with sweat despite the cool air. His green eyes were bloodshot, carrying the weight of sleepless years. He smelled faintly of whiskey, but his voice, though rough, was steady. "We need to talk." Ethan studied him in silence, distrust etched into every line of his face. Robert's reputation had long been one of silent complicity. The man who stood behind Helen, who signed the checks, who never spoke but always nodded. But tonight there was no mask, only exhaustion and guilt. "Come inside," Ethan said finally. They sat at the old wooden table, its surface scarred from decades of meals and arguments. Robert fumbled with his hands, thick fingers trembling. "I can't do it any more," he began, his voice hoarse. "For years I told myself I was just keeping peace, that going along with her meant stability. But what she's done, what I've let her do—" He swallowed hard, eyes glistening. "It's unforgivable. Ethan leaned forward, tone clipped. "Then tell me everything." Robert's story spilled out like a dam breaking. Helen had controlled the HOA with an iron grip, but Harrison had been the architect of the larger scheme. Together, they created shell companies, invoices for maintenance projects that never happened, payments to contractors who didn't exist. Over 18 months, they had siphoned more than $800,000 into accounts linked to Marianne Harrison, the judge's wife. Robert's role had been the signatures, the quiet bookkeeping, making the lies appear legitimate. He had watched families lose homes over petty fines while the money flowed into hidden coffers. "I kept telling myself I had no choice," Robert muttered, his voice cracking. "But last night, when Ethan showed those tapes, when Dorothy spoke up, I saw it in their eyes. They knew, and for the first time, I wanted them to know." Ethan studied the man. Across from him, Robert's cheeks sagged, his stubble uneven, his body carrying the look of someone who had once been strong but had let compromise erode him. But beneath the shame, Ethan glimpsed a flicker of resolve, fragile but real. "Will you testify?" Ethan asked. Robert's jaw tightened, then he nodded slowly. "Yes, but it won't be enough without the papers. I can get them. I know where she keeps the files." The following day, Ethan and Robert drove into town. Rex rode in the back seat, ears pricked, his gaze never leaving the passing fields. Robert directed them not to Helen's immaculate house, but to the office of the HOA itself, a squat building tucked behind the post office. Its facade was deceptively plain, but inside Helen had built her fortress: filing cabinets, locked drawers, a computer that held more power than any gavel. They waited until evening, when the building stood empty. Robert's hands shook as he used his key, the metal jangling like a confession. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, illuminating the rows of filing cabinets. Ethan scanned the room with the caution of a soldier clearing a building, Rex padding at his heel, nose twitching at every scent. Robert moved with surprising certainty, pulling open drawers, extracting files thick with invoices and signatures. He placed them on the table, his breath ragged. "Here. Fake maintenance for storm drains that were never replaced, payments to companies that exist only on paper. And look, this—" He held up a document, his finger trembling over the signature line. "I signed it. My name, my shame." Ethan flipped through the documents, his anger simmering. Each page was proof, a weapon forged from their own greed. He gathered them carefully, photographing each with his phone, creating backups on the spot. By midnight, Ethan sent the files, along with the security footage and Robert's recorded testimony, to Elena Martinez, a lawyer he trusted. Elena was in her early 40s, a Latina attorney with sharp features and sharper instincts. She had jet-black hair that she wore in a sleek bob, eyes that missed nothing, and a reputation for dismantling corrupt officials with surgical precision. Years of fighting uphill battles had given her a voice firm with authority and a patience tempered by fire. She had worked with Ethan before, and though she had once warned him against taking this fight personally, her reply came swift. "This is enough. I'll forward to the FBI tonight." 2 days later, federal agents arrived in Willowbrook. They came without sirens, without spectacle, their dark suits a quiet storm that swept through the town. Helen Ward was taken from her home in handcuffs, her pearl necklace stark against the orange glow of streetlights. Judge Randall Harrison was arrested at his chambers, his heavy frame sagging as agents read him his rights. For years they had walked above the law, untouchable. Now they stumbled like ordinary criminals, their empire collapsing under the weight of their own greed. Ethan watched from the edge of the courthouse square, Rex at his side. The German shepherd sat tall, ears pricked, as though he too understood the gravity of the moment. Robert Ward stood a few feet away, shoulders straighter than Ethan had ever seen, his face pale but relieved. For once, the man was not Helen's shadow. The town murmured with shock, disbelief giving way to relief. Some wept openly, as if a curse had been lifted. Others stood silent, processing the enormity of what had just happened. Dorothy Kim passed by, her apron dusted as always, and whispered to Ethan, "Your father would be proud." Ethan's eyes lingered on the courthouse steps, where Helen and Harrison disappeared into federal cars. The fight was not over. Trials and testimonies would follow, but tonight the foundation had cracked. Justice, long buried beneath lies and fear, was finally clawing its way back into the light. The courthouse in Willowbrook was an old sandstone building with tall columns that once symbolized dignity, though years of misuse had stained its reputation. On the morning of the trial, crowds gathered outside, voices buzzing with equal parts anticipation and disbelief. For the first time in decades, Helen Ward and Judge Randall Harrison would not be standing as rulers of the community, but as defendants facing justice. Inside, the air was heavy with murmurs, the scrape of chairs, the tapping of pens. The gallery was filled with townsfolk, some curious, some anxious, many finally daring to hope. Ethan Cole sat near the front, his posture straight, Rex lying obediently at his feet. The German shepherd, though graying around the muzzle, radiated calm strength. Ethan's hands rested on his knees, but his jaw was tight, his heart steady only because he had prepared himself for this moment his entire life without realizing it. The prosecution was led by Assistant U.S. Attorney Margaret Ellis, a woman in her late 40s with a reputation for dismantling corruption cases. Margaret was tall and lean, with auburn hair tied neatly in a bun, and sharp green eyes that carried both intelligence and a quiet, relentless fire. Her dark suit fit her frame precisely, and she carried herself with the authority of someone who had stared down criminals more powerful than Helen and Harrison. Known for her composure, she rarely raised her voice, but every word struck with weight. On the defense side, Helen sat stiffly, her once immaculate appearance diminished. Her blonde hair had dulled to a weary gray. Her pearl necklace looked out of place against the standard blazer her attorney had insisted she wear. She had lost weight, her angular face sharper now, her eyes hollow. Beside her, Judge Harrison seemed smaller than his reputation had ever allowed. His broad body sagged into the chair, his neatly trimmed beard unable to disguise the deep lines of fear that carved his face. He wore a suit, but it hung loosely, like borrowed clothing. The aura of authority he once commanded had evaporated, leaving behind only a man revealed. Robert Ward sat in the witness area, pale but resolute. His green eyes darted nervously, but his hands no longer trembled as they once had. He was here to testify, to finally sever himself from his wife's shadow. When the trial began, the prosecution wasted no time. Margaret Ellis projected the evidence onto a screen for all to see. The falsified invoices, the shell companies, the transfers to Marianne Harrison's account. She laid it out cleanly, piece by piece, until the scheme was undeniable. Helen shifted in her seat, her lips pressed tight, while Harrison's jaw ground visibly as though he could chew his rage into silence. Then came the recording. Ethan's heart pounded as Margaret cued the audio from his camera. The voices of Helen and Harrison filled the courtroom, cold and unmistakable. The line about his father's heart, giving out with a little help, struck like a thunderclap. Gasps filled the gallery. Some clutched their mouths, others exchanged horrified looks. Dorothy Kim, sitting near the back, let out an audible cry. Harrison's face flushed crimson, his fists clenching until his knuckles whitened. Helen's head dropped, the mask gone. For years she had ruled with her voice, but now silence betrayed her. Margaret Ellis's voice rang firm. This recording, combined with medical testimony, demonstrates a deliberate poisoning with digitalis, a drug that mimics natural heart failure. Samuel Cole did not die by chance. He was silenced because he resisted Ethan's throat tightened. He kept his face composed, but inside grief and rage tangled like barbed wire. His father's death had been more than tragedy. It had been murder wrapped in legality. He glanced down at Rex, who pressed against his leg, grounding him. Robert Ward was called next. He spoke haltingly at first, his broad frame hunched, voice unsteady. But as he described years of forged documents and his own cowardice, his words grew stronger. "I signed because I was weak," he admitted, his green eyes glistening. "But I cannot stay silent any more. My wife and Harrison bled this town dry, and I let them. That ends today." The defense scrambled. Their attorney, a middle-aged man named Thomas Bell, stocky with thinning blonde hair and a perpetually flushed face, argued fabrication, claimed Robert was lying to save himself. But the tide had already turned. The evidence was too strong, the voices too clear. When Helen was asked if she wished to speak before sentencing, she rose unsteadily. Her voice cracked, no longer the weapon it once was. "You don't understand," she hissed, eyes narrowing at Ethan. "Your father destroyed my family's dreams, and I—" She stopped, realizing her words had only damned her further. The room buzzed with shock, then condemnation. She slumped back into her seat, broken. Harrison, when given the chance, said nothing. His cold stare remained fixed forward, but the power behind it had died. The verdict came swift. Guilty on charges of racketeering, fraud, conspiracy, and murder. Sentences that would ensure neither Helen Ward nor Judge Randall Harrison would ever see freedom again. When the gavel fell, the gallery erupted, not in chaos, but in release. Tears flowed, voices rose, neighbors embraced. For the first time in years, Willowbrook felt free. Weeks later, the community gathered again, this time not in a hall filled with fear, but in celebration. The Ward House, once a symbol of tyranny, was stripped of its luxury and repurposed into the Willowbrook Community Center. The rooms that once hosted HOA meetings now held plans for gardens, classes, and gatherings. Children's laughter replaced Helen's cold commands. On the ranch, Ethan worked with his neighbors to restore the rose garden. Young plants were placed into the soil, their roots, spreading into earth once poisoned, but now healing. Dorothy Kim brought cuttings, Linda Foster offered seeds, even Robert Ward, shoulders straighter now, came to help dig. As the sun dipped low, Ethan knelt in the soil, Rex stretched beside him, tail thumping lazily. He brushed dirt from his hands and looked at the small buds swaying gently in the evening breeze. The roses were not yet in bloom, but they would be, just as Willowbrook would bloom again. Ethan placed a hand on Rex's back, his voice a whisper, meant only for the dog and the wind. "Dad, we got them." We finally got them. And as twilight settled, the ranch no longer felt haunted by loss. It felt alive with promise, justice, and the strength of a community reborn. In the end, Ethan and Rex's victory was not only about land, or roses, or even justice in a courtroom. It was about something greater, the quiet miracle that happens when truth breaks through darkness. Some call it resilience, some call it grace. Ethan simply called it his father's legacy. And perhaps in that legacy there was the gentle hand of God, reminding us that no matter how deep the corruption, no matter how heavy the sorrow, light will always find its way back. Just as roses bloom again after poison, so too can our daily lives bloom after trials. Maybe your battle isn't with a tyrant HOA, but with loneliness, illness, or hardship. Still, the promise remains. Every morning carries a new mercy, every night a prayer answered in ways unseen. So if this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment with your thoughts. Subscribe to join our growing family of listeners, and remember, you are not alone in your struggles. May God bless you, guide you, and surround your life with small miracles you never expected.